Testing, testing, testing. All right. Thank you for coming, everyone. So, let's get started. In 1808, amidst a boom of interest in paleontological study, French naturalist and pioneer in the fields of comparative anatomy and paleontology, Georges Cuvier, described a fossilized jaw that had actually been found earlier in the 1770s in the Netherlands. This jaw was not unlike anything that the naturalist had seen before, though, because it seemed to be that of a giant monitor lizard. Hi, my name is Bethany Burke, and today I am here to talk to you about my passion and the pinnacle of aquatic evolution, that is Mosasaurs. So, without further ado, let's dive on in. That was a pun that I very much intended to make, and I don't care if it didn't land. Alrighty. So, what are mosasaurs? First off, mosasaurs were not dinosaurs. There's a lot of confusion about that in the general public, mainly based on massive media franchises like Jurassic World. Mosasaurs lived during the same time as the dinosaurs, which was the Mesozoic era. They specifically lived in the Cretaceous period. Mosasaurs went extinct during the KPG extinction event, and their taxonomy is Kingdom Animalia, Phylum Chordata, Class Reptilia, Order Squamata, Clade Pythonomorpha, Superfamily Mosasauridae, and there are 4 subfamilies to mosasaurs, those being the Mosasaurinae, the Plioplatycarpinae, Tylosaurinae, and the Halosaurinae. Right up here, there is an image of a reconstruction of a tylosaur. All right, so mosasaurs were aquatic creatures. They spent their entire lives in the water, very much like modern-day cetaceans. Cetaceans include whales and porpoises, so they lived their lives in water, but came up to breathe air. Another misconception that is due to media franchises is that they were not related to Megalodon. Megalodon was a shark, and mosasaurs were reptiles. So they were squamates. So what that means is squamata includes lizards and snakes. They were more closely related to lizards and snakes compared to Dinosauria, so the dinosaurs. They were descended from small terrestrial lizards that, of course, had come onto land and then returned to the sea, for an initially semi-aquatic lifestyle that then turned into full-time habitation in the water. So we have up there a nice little picture. So if we can move our eyes towards there, it is still debated which exact living lineage that mosasaurs descended from, and then their ancestors for lizards, but it is generally believed and accepted that they were varanid lizards, meaning that they were related to Komodo dragons and Gila monsters, because it is a surviving suborder. This would make them aquamorphs, which evolved during the late Triassic. Obviously, when we have animals that have adapted completely to the water and they were not water-breathing creatures, there's something going on there. So, started off in the ocean, went on land, came on back. When we think of Gila monsters and Komodo dragons, we think of big, aggressive, kind of slow lizards. And some of those characteristics do transfer over to our understanding of mosasaurs. They were also probably viviparous, which means that they birthed live young. Unlike dinosaurs laid eggs. So the live birth, there is an image of that in the top corner. There has been evidence, and that's very strong, for live birth theory, because there have been juveniles found within the abdomen of certain species of mosasaurs. Their body plan. So their body plan is one of the coolest things, in my opinion, very scientific, things about mosasaurs. They were highly adapted to aquatic life. That is where they lived. That is where they were going to live going forward. They had streamlined bodies. This means that they could turn and move and swim with grace and precision. They had large skulls and a long snout for some of them. Some of them did have a termination in their snout that made it a little shorter. The skull structure is very similar to that of modern-day lizards, which is why the French naturalist that I mentioned previously, Georges Cuvier, thought when he saw the first fossilized jaw of a mosasaur that it must have been related to the monitor lizards, specifically Komodo dragon. They had paddle-like limbs. So I have a little example right here. They had paddle-like limbs, not unlike cetaceans again, that helped them move along in the water. What's interesting about these paddle limbs is that if you can see up in the corner, these limbs had short bones and also many more bones as far as phalanges than their descendants, the lizards. So they had a long tail also with a curve on the end. And I have to put this down real quick, which helped them move through the water in a sort of rudder-like way. They could turn, and this wasn't exactly a great swimming plan long-term, so they probably got a little burst of speed and then slowing down, but it was what they used to hunt down prey and corner them. This is very similar to the down curve in tails that we see in early ichthyosaurs. Ichthyosaurs are the other marine reptiles that look a lot like dolphins, which is an example of convergent evolution. And their backbone consisted of over 100 vertebrae. This right here is my prized find. Right here, I have an atlas vertebra of a tylosaur. I found it in Ladonia, Texas, in the North Sulphur River. This is massive. You have to think of your body and the size of your vertebra. This right here was just one of the 100. They were all this big, mostly in the center. Going down to the caudal vertebra, they got a little different depending on the species of mosasaur. But generally, this hefty guy is what they were working with. We have that. They had snake-like jaws as well. And the more facts that I list, you might notice that I keep coming back to the varanid families where there's the snakes and the lizards. And this really shows us that adaptations that have worked in the past do carry over into modern day. If a body plan works, we are going to see it over and over again. Their teeth were conical, and it had a slight recurve to it. They were set in individual sockets. They were really in there. I thought Family Head Games was a funny slide title. So in the top, we see the skull of a monitor lizard, and then on the bottom is the skull of a mosasaur. Visually, you can see a lot of similarities, which is very interesting. Of course, the teeth and jaw of the monitor lizard look a little different compared to the mosasaur, but the general shape and plan is there, which is why when it was found in the 1770s, the first mosasaur that is, there was that immediately drawn parallel. Right here we have more of the spinal column and just vertebra shown how numerous the mosasaurs had these vertebra. And we have very great fossil evidence of this that is very articulated and shows great indications of how the locomotion of the bodies of mosasaurs would work. Diet. They were not picky eaters, not at all. They were the apex predators of their areas in these seaways. When you are the apex, you have the pick of the litter as far as you want to eat. You want to eat this today? That's fine. They wanted to hunt this today? Also fine. There wasn't really the challenge. But the challenge that there was came from other mosasaurs. Mosasaurs of different species did inhabit the same areas. They were different sizes a lot of the time because niches need to be filled, but also up in the corner we can see that they were cannibalistic, as I was getting into. This is mainly also due to their sheer size. Their metabolic rate was very high. A large creature needs a lot of fuel to get itself going. To keep living, they had to eat. This is kind of how you can think of how sharks are said to need to keep swimming. Mosasaurs had to eat often because how they were moving and how they were just sustaining themselves took a lot of energy. They would have to go to the surface to breathe air, and they needed to keep eating. So they did eat things like, of course, other mosasaurs, but also seabirds and cephalopods, fish, sharks, and ichthyosaurs when they could. What is interesting about this picture right here is that, as listed, it has at least 3 different mosasaur skulls within this fossil remains of the stomach of a mosasaur, but also these were 3 different species of mosasaur. So the mosasaur in which this abdomen stomach belonged was hunting different types of mosasaurs in its same area. One of the most fascinating things about mosasaurs is that they were global powerhouses. Fossil remains of mosasaurs have been found on every continent, and yes, that also includes Antarctica. Having an adaptation so specific to life in the water, we look around today, the oceans are vast. There was a lot of room for niches to be filled that, very much like dinosaurs filled on land, as whether it be apex predators, like carnivores, calling to mind T-Rex. Mosasaurs were very much T-Rexes of the sea. They had the same voracious hunger and hunting capabilities that set them apart from other marine reptiles. So they have been found, lots of partial skeletons, but some complete skeletons all throughout the United States, also Canada in Saskatchewan, which we'll kind of lead into later as well. For the United States, we have Alabama, California, Mississippi, Tennessee, Georgia, and all those states covered in the Western Interior Seaway, including Texas. And then we have Arkansas, the Dakotas. We also have Kansas, New Mexico, and Montana. There are also known mosasaurs as far as specimens found from Mexico. It starts with this man, Georges Cuvier. Everyone needs to bear with me real quick because I'm going to attempt to pronounce this with like French. I actually called my friend who was a French major, and I'm sorry, Dylan, for what is about to happen. Let's see. He was born Jean-Léopold Nicolas Frédéric Baron Cuvier, but he went by George. That's fine. So Georges Cuvier, he was born August 23rd in 1769. Handsome picture of him there in the corner. He was a French naturalist, and keep that in mind, it is important. So he was a French naturalist and immensely famous, not only in his circle, which would be that of comparative anatomy and paleontology, but just in the country as a whole. He had an idea which was not widely accepted, but it is something that we think of often today as far as what we teach in science, and that theory was extinction. He was a huge proponent of the theory of extinction, which really shook up the science of the time. The reason that it was not swept under the rug was because he was so influential. In fact, he was so influential that he was one of Napoleon Bonaparte's favorite scientists, which actually matters to the story. The ruler, Napoleon Bonaparte, would constantly try to get Cuvier to go on expeditions for and with him. Cuvier often said, "No, I don't have time. I like my house." Good for him, knowing his boundaries. So he's called the father of comparative anatomy and paleontology because when you get into it, having creatures that have consistency in visuals kind of gets some people out of their comfort zone, especially in the past. How could something, a creature, look like one creature but be so massive, be on a huge scale compared to what we know in our lives? Comparative anatomy shows, like earlier in the presentation when I showed you the monitor lizard skull and the mosasaur skull, that there are these consistencies. Again, the only reason that this wasn't swept under the rug was because of his influence. I said him being French was important to the description of mosasaurs, and it was because there was an invasion that led to the greatest knowledge or introduction of knowledge of mosasaurs. We'll get to that after I point out that he did not actually name mosasaurs mosasaurs. It is a tricky way to kind of look at discovery of creatures that he had his own non-scientific name for this find, but he did not call it mosasaurs, even though we now know it as a mosasaur. The grand animal of Maastricht. That's what he called it. And it was found deep within a limestone quarry in Maastricht, Netherlands. It was found by the local miners, so just everyday people deep within the fossil deposits. I mentioned earlier that this specific specimen, as far as the Grand Animal de Maastricht, was found in the early 1770s, though there is lots of evidence and indication that the first specimen pulled from the quarry was actually in the early 1760s. So we have over here, Cuvier did not give it the scientific name mosasaur, and it was stolen by the French. That is how he got his hands on it. The French invaded the Netherlands where the animal was found. He called it Le Grand Animal de Maastricht, and it was just a very French name for something in Dutch. That's how we went. Even though this creature is called the Grand Animal of Maastricht, it is not there anymore. It was taken by the army of Napoleon Bonaparte to Paris in the Museum of Natural History, where it remains today. There's only a cast of the initial jaw that was found remaining in Maastricht. And if you go to the History Museum in Maastricht, they will use the opener of "The French have stolen what belongs to us, and it is very important. Please give it back." That's how it is. What we know now about the Grand Animal of Maastricht is that it was Mosasaurus hoffmanni. This was the first described mosasaur. It was finally given a scientific name, 1822, which, happy birthday, mosasaurs, makes it 200 years old. This is a very, very young creature as far as description. So it was coined by a paleontologist named William Daniel Cuvier in 1822, 200 years old. But it was officially named Mosasaurus hoffmanni in 1829, though the term mosasaur came in 1822. It was named this because of the Mos River. That's where it was found in these fossil deposits. The lizard of the Mos River. That's what they called it. Sometimes names are simple, but they are very effective. They also thought that perhaps it was a whale or maybe a fish, because having creatures that were related to lizards like this, it was just not heard of, and it was hard for people to accept. There is a reconstruction of Mosasaurus hoffmanni in Maastricht that they like a lot. So if you ever go, tell them how good they're doing. This is a size comparison to that of an adult man. This is approximately a human male that is 6 foot in height. And then this is our very nice Mosasaurus. There is something important to know about the name. There's Mosasaur, that is the type, and Mosasaurus, which is the species. There's a lot of confusion that maybe when it's a tylosaur, it's a Mosasaurus tylosaur. It's a mosasaur, which is fascinating to think about. And if you look at the size scale, it is kind of hard to fathom that this creature was in the water, swimming along. All right. As someone who studies mosasaurs and honestly loves to talk about them, I am here. One of the questions that I get in my life and study is about Jurassic World. It was awesome for me personally to see representation of a mosasaur in Jurassic World, but there was a lot of inaccuracies. I promise you mosasaurs are still really cool, and sometimes I think that they're cooler than how they were shown in the movie. The mosasaur in the movie was supposed to be Tylosaurus, which at maximum was 50 feet in length. Very, very conservative estimates puts the Jurassic World mosasaur at 100 feet. That's double the size that it was in real life. This prop that I have right here yes, is that Jurassic World mosasaur. And when I give talks on mosasaurs, I like to bring this out. It is something that even someone who is not interested in paleontology might be familiar with because everyone loves a good Jurassic franchise movie. He was cool. He was just a little bit smaller. He was just as ferocious. This is Stan. He helps me show all the cool things about mosasaurs, and you will see him more. In science, inaccuracy can build misunderstanding, which is why I bring up the Jurassic World mosasaur. It can be challenging to put the information and science into the general public when there are depictions like there were in Jurassic World. This is another example of how inconsistency does breed misunderstanding. Was the mosasaur in Jurassic World larger than its real-life counterpart? They could not decide how big they wanted it to be in each movie. It changed. So that adds another layer. At the very top is our friend Stan. That's what he is supposed to be. At the very bottom is the real-life mosasaur. And of course, again, an approximate estimation of a 6-foot human male to show you the size. Something like that swimming around, like what is on the top. We have to think that the blue whale, its sheer size can only be supported because of its life in the water. That type of animal, even the megafauna, could not sustain. Would not translate over. Having a creature that looked like this in real life wouldn't be sustainable. I talked earlier about the diet and touched briefly on the metabolic rate of mosasaurs. Due to the size, even though at the bottom the real life size was huge, it was constantly hunting. It was constantly eating. A creature the size of what is on top is not sustainable. It could not keep the true size range. It's pretty cool, actually, because some of the true size range information that is most important to science comes from Texas, which I think is wonderful, being from here and being happy about it. The small species or genera of mosasaurs, like Platycarpus and our Texas friend, Dillosaurus, how fun, were about 1 to 6 meters in length, which translates to 3.3 or 19.7 feet long. And if we look in the bottom corner with that arrow, the green one on the bottom, that's our tiny little friend, Dillosaurus. He was small. The larger mosasaurs, such as Tylosaurus and Mosasaurus hoffmanni, and of course, our friends from Jurassic World of that size. The real ones were 10 to 15 meters long, and that is maximum, like I said, of 49 feet. Understand, it can get a little tricky. They diversified and became very abundant in the Cretaceous period. Before that, the ichthyosaurs and maybe some familiar names to you like plesiosaurs and pliosaurs were the dominant creatures in the ocean. There was also some armored fish, but the ichthyosaurs and the like were occupying the same niche that the mosasaurs would come to inhabit. They were the apex predators. They took less time to become the dominant type of marine hunter in comparison to the other known marine reptiles. Home sweet home. So mosasaurs lived in the ocean, though I find it important to point out that there has been one species of freshwater mosasaur to be found, and then they likely preferred shallow waters. This is because many fish school in shallow waters because they find it safe. They find it a more enticing area for them to inhabit. So why not what hunts them come knocking on their door? The abundant prey that was in the shallow areas was very important to sustaining the metabolic rate of mosasaurs. And their anatomical structure suggests that they would probably also have been excellent open water or deep ocean swimmers. So their North American environment, and I am going to touch going forward on what makes North American mosasaurs special, and specifically Texas's place in the story of mosasaurs. So the Western Interior Seaway, if we look at the diagram, this water cut through the United States and North America. It started in the Gulf of Mexico in that area, which is why the temperatures and environment, at least to some extent, of the Western Interior Seaway was similar to that of the Gulf of Mexico. So it cut all the way, Gulf of Mexico, into the Arctic Ocean, which may contribute to the fact that mosasaurs were global creatures. They had these waterways that they could inhabit, and species may have started to split off for as the environment changed, the further they went into the seaway, niches would be available that were not in their original location. There was a depth of approximately 400 meters in some parts of the western interior seaway, which were towards the Badlands of North America. It was the perfect environment for mosasaurs. There was life as far as flora for plants, which then drew in fish, which then drew in predators. The temperature is very important as far as lots of species that inhabit water, but it was not as important to mosasaurs as it was other creatures. Their life in the water. Tissue structures of mosasaurs on their bones, which was first evident/noticed in Mosasaurus, specifically Mosasaurus hoffmanni, suggests the metabolic rate is very much higher than modern-day squamates. So it was much higher than the regular lizards that we have today. A lot of people, when they think of lizards, some think of iguanas having to be out in the sun to maintain an internal body temperature that can allow them to move. In lots of places around the world, when there are snakes and lizards in their natural environments, such as Florida, if it is too cold, the bodies of the local reptiles will shut down. They will be unable to move. Sometimes they starve, sometimes their body just goes into shock. This was not the same for mosasaurs, even though they were indeed reptiles and related to these lizards. They were likely endothermic. And so that means that they maintained a consistent body temperature despite influence from the surrounding environment, which again, the temperature of the western interior seaway, great for lots of other creatures such as fish, didn't really matter to mosasaurs. So, some squamates such as iguanas and snakes, and some amphibians also cannot control their internal body temperature themselves and rely on external factors to keep them moving. So, locomotion, and let's see if these videos will work. Very large mosasaurs. When cutting through the water, they had a lot of adaptations. We can see in modern day snakes, such as the sea snake, well, I suppose that the slide is not going to work. When swimming through the water, snakes do a motion kind of like this, a very snake-like way to swim. Mosasaurs kept their body rigid. What they relied on was these massive ruddered tails that swept like this. So unlike other squamates, which moved like this, mosasaurs had a body plan which kept them rigid, used these flippers with the more numerous and controlled phalanges to move themselves throughout the water. So analysis of mosasaur bodies show that when swimming, they would have been held fairly rigid, like I mentioned before. That does not mean that their bodies did not move. When going through the water, even though they had these very nice heads that would be very dynamic, they still had to move their bodies. It's very important to also know that while their spines remained rigid, they did have similar spines and skeletal structures as snakes and lizards. So we can learn about mosasaurs from studying specifically monitor lizards. So their method of propulsion would have been moving their tail side to side like this. This greatly increases the push that they would get. They could take tight corners, but it was not sustainable. They then used their flippers to maybe sometimes glide. There's a lot of different evidence as far as the mosasaur swimming habits go. It was originally thought that they moved like snakes, but that has been widely abandoned as a theory. Their general skull description. So there's a noticeable consistency throughout all genera of mosasaurs, which is that their skull is conical, it is laterally compressed, so it has this nice taper to it. When the skull is complete, we can see that they were very kinetic. Going to go to my friend Stan again. Kinetic skulls, as far as the general public are most familiar with, are that of snakes. I'm sure everyone has seen maybe a video or an actual snake unhinging its jaw and perhaps eating an egg or swallowing a mouse, poor mouse, whole. It's very similar to mosasaurs. The double-hinged jaw was possible because the jaw itself was split into two different sides. Kinetic skull, meaning they weren't fused completely, or at least in the way that we think of as far as mammals, which have one jawbone. We have a jawbone that is completely connected, goes around. Mosasaurs did not. They had a left and right side, which made their mouths grow open and shut a lot more than creatures such as ourselves. So the joints in the mouths were more flexible than those of most other creatures. Squamates have very specific adaptations to compensate for their size at some point. Some snakes that do not rely on venom have more of a kinetic skull, even though there is consistency seen throughout the family. So these are the structural components of a mosasaur skull. We have very familiar things right here. We have a maxillary, we have the dentary being jaw, premaxillary, articular, surangular, prearticular, angular, splenal, postorbital, frontal, prefrontal, quadrate, as some of them. This is very fascinating because we have teeth, the dentary, the jaw. I mentioned before that each tooth had its own individual socket, and teeth can tell us a lot about a creature. The adaptations that teeth show can tell us more about the environment that the creature lived. And there are two main types of teeth seen in mosasaurs. That being, some specialized teeth were more mushroom-shaped and circular because it helped with crushing the shells of cephalopods and perhaps armored fish. When thinking about it, there needed to be a more precise and, as far as surface area, getting to crush. Stabbing is great. Crushing when you want something inside a shell is the way to go. There's also the typical tooth variation of mosasaurs, the conical and elongated teeth that come to a point. Teeth were constantly shed. When we think of teeth that are constantly shed, many think of sharks. It was not a row by row replacement exactly like sharks, but there was a refresh in the teeth. We have over here in the corner it's showing that a tooth was growing underneath the other, getting ready to expel it from the jawbone. It was easier for mosasaurs to do this as far as anatomy because each tooth was in its own socket. When humans have their teeth grow in, and sometimes when you think of our teeth, is that we have overcrowded mouths a lot of the time, and when a new tooth comes in, it will shift how we use our teeth, and wisdom teeth as well will crowd our jaws. So here's one of the coolest things, in my opinion, about mosasaurs. This is pronounced pterygoid, so the pterygoid teeth. The pterygoid teeth, they had a second set of teeth. It was not exactly like what you see in Ripley Scott's masterpiece Alien. They could not shoot it out, but it was another way to keep their prey to themselves. It's found in snakes as well, and it was embedded into the upper palate of the mosasaur. As we can see over here in this picture, it is the wide jaw of the mosasaur open, and then a view from under for those pterygoid teeth. It kept, as far as the pterygoid teeth, it kept prey from getting out. In cetaceans, large ones that have baleen, it is to filter the small creatures that they eat. The mosasaur was not one that fed on microscopic organisms. It had pretty hefty prey, so they were powerful in some respects and would try to get out. They had a lot of a harder time doing this with the pterygoid teeth latching onto them. Even if they got a little farther, the teeth would sink into them, keep them inside of the jaw of the mosasaur, and perhaps, if they did escape, do irreparable damage to their body. Some evidence does suggest that mosasaurs could swallow their prey whole. Another example, a very nice one in my opinion, of pterygoid teeth. You can see the regular jaw of the mosasaur and then that upper palate lined with teeth. So we are coming towards a close for this presentation, and I wanted to touch on Texas mosasaurs. Texas has a great place in the study and history of mosasaurs. Texas was part of the Western Interior Seaway that I covered earlier, and the Gulf of Mexico, of course, was very important to that. Our understanding of mosasaurs in size and biology was changed by a Texas find, and that was Dallosaurus. As its name probably suggests and brings to mind, it was found in the Dallas area. So giving this presentation in Keene, y'all aren't too far from a very important site in the history of mosasaurs. There's also the Onion Creek mosasaur, which was found in the early 1930s in my hometown, Austin, Texas. It is the only type of this mosasaur as far as the area in which it was found. So Maximus literally means big mosasaur. Mosasaurus. And then Tylosaurs were found in Texas, like my very nice vert right here. I found this in Ladonia, Texas, North Sulphur River. It is the thing I love most in this world. I am sorry, family, but it is true. So the end. Thank you for having me today. I have time for some questions, and I did want to touch on, I am a professional speaker and educator for paleontology. I specialize in showing children that there is a wide, wide world of ancient life out there that is fascinating, and more than just dinosaurs, even though dinosaurs were really cool. I go by BK Bones, and if you want to know more about how perhaps you have someone young in your family that loves dinosaurs, I would love to help. And so, again, thanks for having me. I'm Bethany Burke. I love mosasaurs. Does anyone have any questions? Anyone at all? Is there a hand raised over there? I can't tell. None? All righty. Well, again, thank you for having me. I do feel the need to tell a story real quick about this vert and how I thought I was going to die for it. It was in a ravine in Ladonia, Texas, and I was so happy to have found it. And I was there, and I did not look up and see the storm clouds. There was a flash flood while I was down in this ravine. I had scaled down into the ravine pretty easily because the dirt was dry. When things get wet, they're not dry. That was very poetic. I had to scale up this ravine with my rock hammer and a pickaxe. I had been there for 45 minutes, and let me tell you, if you are interested in fossil hunting, please tell someone where you are going. When I go rock hounding or fossil hunting, I always let My friends know, my family know. I give them my GPS location, and we have organized check-in times. That's all great, but not if you don't have cell reception. Down there for 45 minutes, decided I was going to do it. Put this friend in my shirt, tied it up, climbed up, thought I dropped it, started to cry, but I didn't. Here it is. I love it. So, everyone have a great day. Thank you very much for coming.